Steve Jobs walked out of Apple carrying almost nothing. No applause, no celebration, no cameras waiting outside the building. Just silence. A few years earlier, he had been the face of one of the most exciting companies in America. Magazine covers called him a genius. Investors treated him like the future of technology itself. Now, he was 30 years old, emotionally exhausted, and no longer welcome inside the company he helped build in his parents' garage. Imagine creating something that changes your entire life, and then watching strangers slowly take control of it. That's what happened to Steve Jobs in 1985. For months, the humiliation followed him everywhere. Newspapers described him as difficult, reckless, immature. Some people inside Silicon Valley quietly assumed the story was already over. And honestly, it would have been easy to believe them. Most founders never recover after something like that. For a long time, that moment looked like the end of the story. But strangely, it became the beginning of something much bigger, because the man Apple removed in 1985 would later return and help reshape not just the company, but modern life itself. Phones, music, animation, the internet. The way humans communicate, the way people spend attention, the way millions of people move through daily life. And maybe the strangest part of all, at the moment he got fired, almost nobody believed any of that would happen. To understand why that moment mattered so much, you have to go back to a completely different version of Silicon Valley. The 1970s did not look futuristic. There were no smartphones, no social media, no streaming platforms, no modern internet. Computers were mostly giant machines hidden inside universities, military facilities, and corporate buildings. For ordinary people, technology still felt distant, cold, complicated. But beneath the surface, something quiet was beginning. Across California, a small group of engineers and dreamers had started imagining a future where computers could belong to normal people, small enough to sit on a desk, cheap enough to own at home, simple enough to use without special training. One of those dreamers was Steve Wozniak. Wozniak loved building things. He was shy, deeply technical, and unbelievably talented as an engineer. He could spend hours designing computer systems simply because he enjoyed solving problems. Steve Jobs was completely different. He cared less about engineering itself and more about possibility. Jobs could walk into a room and make people believe something impossible was suddenly achievable. He obsessed over design, over emotion, over human experience. Sometimes he sounded more like an artist than a businessman. The two met through mutual friends and quickly formed an unusual partnership. Wozniak could build almost anything. Jobs could see what those inventions might become. At first, Apple barely looked like a company. The famous garage in Los Altos was crowded with wires, tools, circuit boards, and half-finished machines. At night, the rooms stayed bright for hours, while employees worked surrounded by piles of parts and empty soda bottles. Music played quietly in the background. People argued about designs. Someone was always testing something. The atmosphere felt chaotic, uncertain, and strangely electric. Money was always a problem. Wozniak sold his scientific calculator. Jobs sold his van. Every dollar mattered. And despite all the pressure, there was also a feeling that they were standing dangerously close to the future, even if nobody fully understood what that future would become yet. The Apple I computer was simple compared to modern technology, but it represented a major shift. Instead of serving governments or giant corporations, it was designed for individuals. That idea alone felt revolutionary. Then something surprising happened. People started buying it. A local computer store placed an order for dozens of units. Investors slowly appeared. Employees joined the company. Expectations grew larger. And almost overnight, Apple stopped feeling like a tiny experiment and started feeling like a company racing against time. The late 1970s and early 1980s were exploding with technological ambition. New startups appeared constantly. Silicon Valley started attracting dreamers, engineers, and investors from everywhere. The future suddenly felt open. But while Apple grew quickly, Steve Jobs was becoming famous for something else too: intensity. Employees later described working with him as emotionally exhausting and deeply motivating at the same time. He demanded impossible deadlines. He pushed people aggressively. He obsessed over tiny details many others considered irrelevant. Even parts hidden inside computers had to look beautiful. Some employees feared him. Others admired him. Many felt both emotions simultaneously. But despite the pressure, Apple kept winning. Then came the Apple II. The machine became one of the first massively successful personal computers in history. Sales exploded. Apple expanded rapidly, and in 1980, the company went public. Suddenly, Steve Jobs became incredibly wealthy before turning 30. From the outside, the story looked perfect. Young founder, revolutionary company, massive success. But fast success often creates new problems quietly. Apple was no longer a small, rebellious startup. Investors wanted predictability. Executives wanted structure. The company needed experienced leadership capable of competing against corporate giants. And one giant in particular was becoming impossible to ignore: IBM. When IBM entered the personal computer market in 1981, many people assumed the battle was already over. IBM represented stability, trust, and enormous corporate power. Compared to IBM, Apple still looked young, emotional, and unpredictable. Jobs understood the danger immediately. If Apple tried competing directly against IBM using traditional business logic, the company would probably lose. So he pushed for something radically different. That idea eventually became the Macintosh. Today, the Macintosh feels historically inevitable. Back then, it was risky, expensive, and emotionally draining. Jobs wanted the machine to feel human, friendly, simple, creative. He hated complexity. He hated ugly design. He believed technology should disappear into the experience itself. But while the Macintosh team worked obsessively toward that vision, tensions inside Apple kept growing. Late at night, exhausted engineers slept under desks while deadlines kept moving closer. Some employees cried in bathrooms after meetings with Jobs. Others stayed because they believed they were building something historic. That emotional contradiction existed everywhere inside Apple. People felt drained, but they also felt part of something unusually important. Meanwhile, costs increased. Deadlines slipped. Arguments became more personal. Executives blamed Jobs for unrealistic decisions. Jobs blamed executives for lacking courage and imagination. Meetings became tense. Alliances formed quietly. Trust slowly disappeared. And then, in 1985, the conflict exploded. The Apple board sided with John Sculley. Steve Jobs lost operational control of the Macintosh division. Soon after, he left Apple completely. It's difficult to fully understand how painful that moment felt emotionally. Apple was not simply a company to him, it was identity, purpose, obsession, meaning. And suddenly, it was gone. For months, Jobs felt publicly humiliated. Friends later described him as emotionally lost during that period. He had spent years convincing himself that Apple and Steve Jobs were almost the same thing. Now the company continued without him. Newspapers described him as reckless and immature. Many people inside Silicon Valley quietly believed his best years were already behind him. And honestly, that didn't sound unreasonable at the time. Many founders disappear after early success. Building one revolutionary company is already rare. Doing it twice feels almost impossible. What nobody realized yet was that Steve Jobs himself was changing during this period, and that change would later affect nearly every product Apple created. But while Jobs struggled emotionally, something else started happening quietly. Reflection. Years later, Jobs admitted that getting fired from Apple eventually became one of the best things that happened to him. Not because it felt good, it absolutely didn't, but because failure removed the pressure of maintaining an image. For the first time in years, he felt creatively free again. Soon after leaving Apple, Jobs launched a new company called Next. From a business perspective, Next looked complicated almost immediately. The computers were beautiful, advanced, and incredibly expensive. Once again, Jobs obsessed over design. Employees spent enormous amounts of time perfecting details ordinary customers might barely notice. The technology impressed engineers and universities. Commercially, however, Next struggled badly. And yet hidden inside the failure was something incredibly important. The Next operating system was years ahead of its time. At the same time, another unexpected chapter entered Jobs' life. Pixar. Originally purchased from George Lucas in 1986, Pixar did not initially look like a future entertainment giant. The company focused heavily on computer graphics technology and lost money for years. Jobs personally financed much of the operation, while uncertainty kept growing. There were moments when Pixar looked dangerously close to collapse. Jobs considered selling the company multiple times, but inside Pixar, a small group of artists and engineers believed computers could eventually create emotionally powerful animated films. At the time, many people doubted audiences would emotionally connect with fully digital animation. Then Toy Story arrived in 1995. The film became a massive global success and changed animation forever. Suddenly, Pixar transformed from a struggling technology experiment into one of the most respected creative studios in the world. And during those years away from Apple, Steve Jobs changed too. The younger Jobs often operated through confrontation and emotional intensity. The older Jobs still demanded excellence, but failure and uncertainty had reshaped him psychologically. Meanwhile, Apple itself was entering serious trouble. By the mid-1990s, the company looked lost. Products felt confusing. Leadership changed repeatedly. Microsoft dominated personal computing globally. Financial losses kept growing. At one point, analysts openly discussed the possibility of Apple collapsing completely. And inside that crisis, Apple made a decision that would reshape technology history. The company bought Next in 1996. Officially, the acquisition focused heavily on software. Apple desperately needed a modern operating system, and Next's technology offered exactly that. But hidden inside the deal was something much bigger. Steve Jobs was coming back. At first, his return looked temporary. Few people imagined he would fully retake control. But inside Apple, leadership instability continued. Confidence remained weak. Then, in 1997, Apple made another shocking announcement. Microsoft invested $150 million into the company. For many Apple fans, the moment felt painful. Microsoft had become the symbol of everything Apple supposedly fought against. But Apple needed stability desperately, and Jobs understood survival mattered more than pride. That decision revealed something important about him. Despite his enormous ego and intense personality, he could still adapt when reality demanded it. And slowly, Apple started changing. Jobs simplified the product lineup aggressively. He eliminated projects, he reduced confusion. Teams focused more clearly. The company stopped trying to be everything simultaneously. Then came the iMac. Bright colors, friendly design, internet-focused simplicity. Compared to the cold, beige computers dominating the market at the time, the product felt alive. Customers noticed immediately. Apple finally looked exciting again. But the real transformation was still coming. In the early 2000s, technology itself started changing rapidly. The internet expanded. Music moved online. Mobile devices became more powerful. Human behavior around media and communication started shifting almost daily. Jobs saw another opportunity. At the time, the music industry looked chaotic. People downloaded songs illegally through services like Napster. Traditional companies struggled to adapt. Apple responded with the iPod. Thousands of songs in your pocket. Today, that idea sounds ordinary. Back then, it felt almost magical. The combination of hardware, software, and simplicity created an experience competitors struggled to match. Then Apple launched iTunes. Suddenly, buying digital music legally became easier than stealing it. That insight mattered deeply. People often choose convenience over resistance. Technology changes behavior fastest when it removes friction from everyday life. Apple understood this repeatedly. Then, in 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage wearing jeans, sneakers, and his famous black turtleneck. The audience already expected something important, but very few people understood. They were about to watch one of the most influential product launches in modern history. Inside his hand was a device that looked surprisingly small. The iPhone. Today, smartphones dominate modern life so completely that it's difficult to remember how revolutionary the first iPhone felt. Before it arrived, phones and internet devices usually felt clumsy and frustrating. Physical keyboards dominated. Mobile internet felt awkward. The iPhone changed expectations almost instantly. Touchscreens suddenly felt natural. Apps became ecosystems. The internet escaped desktop computers permanently, and the psychological effects spread far beyond technology itself. Human attention changed. Communication changed. Photography changed. Relationships changed. Even silence changed. People began carrying the internet inside their pockets every moment of the day. Competitors underestimated Apple once again. Some executives dismissed touchscreen phones as impractical. Others believed physical keyboards would remain essential forever. History repeated itself. The companies most comfortable with the present often struggled to recognize the future early enough. Meanwhile, Apple transformed from a computer company into one of the most powerful brands on Earth. But beneath all the success, Steve Jobs faced another private battle: cancer. In 2003, doctors diagnosed him with a rare form of pancreatic cancer. At first, Jobs delayed surgery while exploring alternative treatments. The decision remains controversial today, and some people close to him later questioned whether waiting made the situation worse. For years, rumors about his health spread constantly. Public appearances became emotionally charged. Fans analyzed photographs, looking for signs of physical decline. And yet Jobs continued working. He introduced products, led presentations, made decisions, shaping entire industries. But physically, he looked thinner every year. In 2011, Steve Jobs resigned as Apple's CEO. A few months later, he died at the age of 56. The reaction around the world felt unusually emotional for the death of a business executive. People left flowers outside Apple stores. Customers shared personal stories online. Many described Apple products almost emotionally, not just technologically. That emotional connection did not happen accidentally. Steve Jobs believed technology should feel personal, simple, human. He obsessed over how people experienced products emotionally, not just functionally. And maybe that's why his story still feels powerful today. Because underneath all the business success, this is really a story about identity, failure, reinvention, and obsession. When Jobs got fired from Apple in 1985, many people assumed the story was finished. Instead, failure forced him to evolve. The companies he built after leaving Apple changed animation, software, music, phones, and digital culture itself. And the lessons he learned during those difficult years eventually helped save Apple from collapse. Ironically, the company became stronger, partly because he lost it first. Today, Apple is worth trillions of dollars. Its products shape modern routines almost invisibly. Millions of people wake up every morning and immediately reach for devices connected to ideas Steve Jobs once fought for obsessively. Phones glow beside beds in dark rooms. People scroll before speaking to anyone. Music follows them through airports, trains, offices, and city streets. The future Jobs imagined decades ago became so normal that most people barely notice it anymore. But underneath all the polished stores, glowing screens, and global success, the emotional core of the story still feels surprisingly human. A young founder builds a company, loses control of it, gets pushed out publicly, feels broken, starts over, fails again, learns, returns older and different, and changes the world anyway. Most people imagine success as a straight line moving upward. Real life almost never works that way. Sometimes the moment that looks like destruction becomes the beginning of transformation. And somewhere tonight, millions of people will fall asleep with an iPhone charging beside their bed, without realizing the man who imagined that future was once pushed out of the company he created. And sometimes, getting fired from the company you created becomes the reason history remembers your name forever.
Thank you so much for listening to this audiobook. I truly hope these words inspired you, motivated you, and gave you something valuable to take with you into everyday life. If you enjoyed this recording, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and explore my other inspiring audiobooks created to support your growth, mindset, and motivation. Your support means a lot and helps me create more content for listeners like you. See you in the next audiobook.